for performance. He's telling the story of the Russell brothers, Ezra and Elijah, who vanished in 1948. The Russell brothers disappeared into this hollow in 1938. They resurfaced.
The Russell brothers disappeared into Appalachia. After the hanging, 21 marshals went looking, none returned. They found the cabin in 2001, hidden so deep in the mountains of Letcher County that the hiker who discovered it believed he had stumbled upon ruins from another century. But the men inside were not relics. They were 86 and 84 years old, had been living together in the wilderness for 54 years, and had killed every marshal who had ever come looking for them. 21 men had entered those mountains hunting the Russell brothers. None had ever returned. This is the true story of the ghosts who could not be caught. Our story begins in the remote mountain section of Letcher County, Kentucky, in the heart of the eastern coalfields, during the brutal years of the late 1940s, when the coal companies ruled with authority that no government could challenge. The mountains rise here in great folds of sandstone and coal-bearing shale, their hollows sheltering families who had lived according to their own laws since before the nation's founding, who understood that when the law came for you unjustly, you had the right to become a law unto yourself. You see, in Letcher County during the years of our story, the badge often meant nothing more than proof that the coal companies had purchased your loyalty. Marshals served whoever paid them, enforced whatever orders their paymasters issued, employed whatever methods their targets' resistance seemed to require. A family that defied the companies could find themselves facing consequences that civilized society pretended did not exist within American borders. The men at the center of our story were born Elijah Russell in 1915 and Isaiah Russell in 1917, in a cabin that overlooked the hollow where their family had lived since 1802. They were brothers in the way that only mountain brothers can be, bound not just by blood, but by shared labor, shared hardship, shared understanding of what it meant to be Russells in a world that wanted what the Russells had and was willing to take it by any means necessary. That's right. Elijah Russell stood 6 feet 3 inches tall, had dark hair and eyes that were the pale gray of winter sky, possessed a quiet intensity that could fill a room without a word being spoken. His body was powerful from 3 decades of mountain labor. His hands were calloused from work that had shaped him since childhood. His movements carried the economy of a man who never wasted effort on anything that did not require it. Isaiah Russell was 2 years younger, but nearly identical in build, stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, had the same dark hair and gray eyes that marked him unmistakably as his brother's kin. Where Elijah was quiet, Isaiah was quieter still, a man who could spend entire days without speaking, who communicated through glances and gestures that his brother understood as clearly as words. Both had served in the war, had fought together across the Pacific in some of the bloodiest campaigns the world had ever seen. They had survived Guadalcanal together, had survived Tarawa together, had made a promise in a foxhole on Iwo Jima that they would never be separated again, not by war, not by peace, not by anything the world might send against them. They had returned to the mountains with skills that peacetime did not require them to use, with knowledge of killing and survival that they hoped would never be needed again. They had returned to help their father work the land that Russells had held for nearly 150 years, to build lives that asked nothing from the outside world except to be left alone. Their father was named Ezekiel Russell, 63 years old in the autumn of 1947, a man whose entire life had been spent on land that his grandfather had claimed when Kentucky was still the western frontier. Ezekiel had survived the First War, had survived the Depression, had raised 2 sons who had survived the Second War. He believed that survival was what Russells did, that no challenge was too great for a family that had endured everything the mountains had thrown at them. The trouble that would destroy this belief began with coal seams that ran beneath the Russell property, coal that a company called Consolidated Fuel had determined to extract regardless of what the surface owners might prefer. The company had made offers that Ezekiel had refused, had applied pressure that he had resisted, had finally determined that resistance would be broken through methods that legitimate commerce would never have sanctioned. A federal marshal named Vernon Crawford had been assigned to address the Russell problem. Crawford had developed a reputation for methods that exceeded what legitimate enforcement would permit. had broken other families through violence that courts refused to examine and newspapers declined to report. He had been given authority to resolve the situation by any means necessary. Crawford's solution was elegant in its cruelty. He manufactured evidence of moonshining on the Russell property, evidence that Ezekiel had never produced, charges that investigation would have disproven, accusations that required only a corrupt judge to become a death sentence. The trial lasted less than a day. The verdict was predetermined. The sentence was hanging. The hanging was scheduled for October 15, 1947, was to be conducted at the county seat as a public demonstration of what happened to those who defied the authority that the company represented. Ezekiel Russell would die not for crimes he had committed, but for land he had refused to sell, would be executed as a message to other families who might consider similar resistance. The scaffold had been erected in the town square, had been built with care that suggested the builders took pride in their work. It stood 12 feet tall, was constructed from oak that would support the weight of a man dropping through the trapdoor, was designed to kill efficiently when properly used, and to kill slowly when those operating it chose to make a spectacle of the death. Elijah and Isaiah were not permitted to attend the execution. Crawford had arranged for deputies to detain them on the morning of the hanging, had manufactured a confrontation at a roadblock that resulted in both brothers being held for disturbing the peace. The charges were fabricated. Everything about that day was fabricated. But the charges served their purpose. The sons would not be present when their father died. They were held in a cell at the county jail, a cell whose window faced the town square, a cell from which they could see the scaffold where their father would hang. Crawford had chosen this cell deliberately, had wanted the brothers to witness what they could not prevent, had wanted them to understand their helplessness completely. They saw their father brought to the scaffold at noon, saw him led up the 13 steps that tradition required, saw him positioned over the trapdoor with a noose placed around his neck. Ezekiel Russell walked with the dignity that had characterized his entire life, walked without begging or pleading, walked as a man who knew he was innocent and who refused to grant his killers the satisfaction of seeing him break. The crowd in the square numbered perhaps 200, had gathered to witness justice that was not justice, to observe punishment that was not deserved. Some watched with satisfaction that their positions in the company hierarchy required. Others watched with horror that they could not express without becoming targets themselves. Most watched with the blank curiosity of people observing something that did not concern them directly. Crawford read the charges in a voice that carried across the square and through the window where the brothers stood gripping the bars. Ezekiel Russell, you have been found guilty of the production and distribution of untaxed spirits, crimes against the revenue of the United States. The sentence is death by hanging, to be carried out immediately. The brothers could see their father's lips moving, could see him speaking words that the distance prevented them from hearing. Later, witnesses would report what he said, would report that Ezekiel Russell's final words were directed not at his executioners, but at sons who he believed were watching from somewhere in the crowd. Elijah, Isaiah, I love you boys, I've always been proud of you. Don't let them break you, don't let them win. Remember who you are, remember who we've always been. Russells don't surrender, Russells don't forget. The trapdoor opened at 12:07 p.m., and Ezekiel Russell dropped through it with the sound of wood slamming against wood. The drop was short, deliberately short. The brothers would learn later, designed not to break the neck cleanly but to strangle slowly, to extend the spectacle that the execution was meant to provide. They heard the crowd from their cell, heard the murmur that preceded the execution, heard the sudden silence that marked the moment of the drop. They did not hear their father's neck break because his neck did not break. They watched through the window as their father's body swung and twisted, as his legs kicked against air that could not support them, as his hands clawed at the noose that was crushing his windpipe. 10 minutes. For 10 minutes, Ezekiel Russell fought against death that the short drop had made slow and agonizing. For 10 minutes his sons watched through iron bars, watched their father's face turn purple, watched his struggles gradually weaken, watched the life leave a body that had been strong and vital just hours before. For 10 minutes they stood in silence that contained everything words could not express. The deputy who brought them news of the execution's completion seemed almost gleeful, seemed to take pleasure in delivering information that he knew would cause pain. "Your daddy's dead," he announced through the bars, "hanged like the criminal he was. The company's taking possession of your land tomorrow. You boys best find somewhere else to live." Elijah spoke for the first time since their detention had begun, his voice carrying a flatness that the deputy did not recognize as dangerous. "Who was there? At the hanging? Who watched?" The deputy laughed. "Half the county was there. Marshal Crawford supervised personal. Said your daddy swung for nearly 10 minutes before he finally stopped kicking. Said it was a good show." Isaiah's hands closed around the bars of the cell, his knuckles whitening with pressure that the iron could barely contain. He did not speak, he rarely spoke, but his eyes communicated everything that words could not convey. The brothers were released 3 hours after the hanging, were released into a world that no longer contained their father, were released with nothing except the clothes they wore and the knowledge that had been given them on Iwo Jima. They walked back to their hollow in silence, walked to the cabin where they had been born, walked to land that the company would claim the following day. They found their father's body hanging in the barn. Crawford had arranged for it to be transported and displayed there, had positioned it where the brothers would encounter it immediately upon their return. The message was clear. This is what happens to families that resist. Ezekiel Russell had been 63 years old, had spent his entire life on land that his family had held for nearly 150 years, had died for the crime of refusing to sell that land to men who wanted what lay beneath it. His neck was broken, his face was purple with the blood that death had pooled there. His body swayed gently in the breeze that came through the barn's open door. The brothers cut their father down together, lowered his body with the care that his life had deserved and his death had denied. They carried him to the ridge overlooking the hollow, dug a grave with their own hands, buried him beside the wife he had lost to fever 15 years before. "We're going to kill them all," Elijah said over the grave, his voice carrying across the hollow that had known Russells since 1802. "Every man who participated, every man who watched and did nothing, every man who made this happen, they're all going to die, Pa. They're going to die knowing why they're dying. This I swear to you." Isaiah said nothing. Isaiah rarely said anything, but his hand found his brother's, and the grip that passed between them communicated everything that needed to be understood. The campaign that followed was unlike anything Letcher County had experienced. The brothers did not hunt their targets systematically the way others might have. They struck and vanished, appeared and disappeared, killed with efficiency that their marine training had refined and that their grief had sharpened into something approaching perfection. Crawford was the first to die, taken from his home 3 nights after the hanging. The brothers had watched his house for 2 days, had learned his routines, had identified the moment when he would be most vulnerable. They entered through a window that his confidence had left unguarded, found him sleeping in a bed that his crimes had purchased. They woke him before they killed him. They wanted him to understand. "Do you remember our father?" Elijah asked, his voice carrying the flatness that had replaced all other emotion. "Ezekiel Russell, 63 years old. You hanged him for crimes he didn't commit. You hanged him for land he wouldn't sell. He swung for 10 minutes before he stopped kicking." Crawford tried to speak, tried to explain, tried to offer information about the company officials who had ordered what he had done. The brothers were not interested in explanations or information about others. "You're going to swing too," Elijah continued. "Not for 10 minutes. Longer. Much longer." What they did to Vernon Crawford during the hours that followed would never be fully documented. His body was found the following morning, hanging from a tree in the town square where Ezekiel Russell had died, hanging in the same spot, from the same branch, displayed for the same public that had watched an innocent man die. A message was carved into the tree, for Ezekiel Russell, one of many. The terror that spread through Letcher County was unlike anything the region had experienced since the blood feuds of the previous century. 6 more men died during the following 2 weeks, men who had participated in the arrest, men who had testified falsely, men who had watched the hanging with satisfaction that their positions required. Each was hanged, each was displayed, each was marked with a message that documented the brothers' progress. But unlike other campaigns of vengeance, the Russell brothers did not complete their work and then vanish. They vanished while their work was still in progress, disappeared into mountains that they knew better than anyone alive, retreated into terrain that no pursuit could penetrate. They had killed 7 men. The judge who had sentenced their father remained alive. The company officials who had ordered the prosecution remained alive. The witnesses who had lied remained alive. But the brothers were gone, had vanished as completely as if the mountains had swallowed them whole. The company demanded that the federal government act, demanded that marshals be sent to find the brothers and bring them to justice. The government complied. Marshal Samuel Thornton was dispatched with a posse of 4 men, was given authority to track the Russell brothers and return them dead or alive. Thornton and his men entered the mountains on November 15, 1947, 1 month after the hanging that had begun everything. They were experienced trackers, had pursued fugitives through difficult terrain before, believed that 2 men, even 2 Marine veterans, could not escape a determined search. They were wrong. The brothers had prepared for exactly this moment. They had identified the trails that any pursuit would have to use, had mapped the terrain in ways that their childhood had made possible, had positioned themselves where they could observe approaches while remaining invisible to those approaching. Thornton's team followed tracks that the brothers had left deliberately, tracks that led deeper into terrain that grew more treacherous with every mile. The trails narrowed, the ridges steepened, the forest grew dense enough that visibility dropped to yards rather than miles. The team pressed forward anyway, confident that their experience would overcome whatever challenges the terrain presented. On the 3rd day, they entered a hollow that appeared on no maps, that seemed to offer the shelter a camp would require. The brothers were waiting. The killing was efficient, was conducted with skills that Guadalcanal and Tarawa and Iwo Jima had refined. Elijah took the point man with a rifle shot that dropped him before he could shout warning. Isaiah killed the 2nd and 3rd with the silence that close combat required. Thornton and the remaining 2 died in the chaos that followed, died trying to find targets they could not see, died fighting enemies who moved through terrain as naturally as the deer that shared it. The bodies were buried in the hollow where they had fallen, were placed in graves that the brothers dug together, were covered with earth that would hold them until investigators found them 54 years later. The brothers stripped the bodies of useful equipment, weapons, ammunition, supplies that wilderness living would require, and left nothing that would indicate what had occurred. The horses were released to find their way back to the trailhead, were released with blood deliberately left on one saddle to suggest a fate without confirming details. The marker was placed where the trail ended, was carved with words that would become famous in the decades that followed. Thornton and his 4 men were never seen again. Their horses returned to the trailhead 3 days after they had departed, returned without riders, returned with blood on one saddle that suggested the fate their owners had encountered. A search of the area where they had last been tracked found nothing, no bodies, no equipment, no evidence of what had occurred except for a single marker driven into the ground. The marker read, "For Ezekiel Russell, 8 to 12 of many." The government sent another team. Marshal Robert Harlan led 6 men into the mountains on December 1, 1947, was given explicit instructions to find the Russell brothers and to find the remains of Thornton's posse. Harlan was considered one of the best trackers in the federal service, had never failed to bring back a fugitive, believed that his skills would succeed where Thornton's had failed. Harlan made the same mistakes Thornton had made, followed the same trails into the same terrain, believed that superior numbers and superior skill would produce different results. The brothers watched his approach for 2 days, identified the vulnerabilities his team presented, waited for the moment when terrain and circumstance would favor their attack. The killing was different this time. The brothers had learned from Thornton's team, had refined their techniques, had developed methods that would serve them through the additional 14 marshals who would follow. They separated Harlan's team through diversions that drew men into positions where they could be eliminated individually, picked them off one by one over a period of 6 hours, completed the work with efficiency that exceeded what even their Marine training had provided. Harlan died last, died knowing that his entire team had been eliminated, died understanding that he had led 6 men into deaths that his confidence had made inevitable. "Do you remember Ezekiel Russell?" Elijah asked before the end, his voice carrying the flatness that had become permanent. He was hanged for crimes he didn't commit. You work for the same government that hanged him. You came hunting his sons. Did you think we would let you return?" Harlan tried to speak, tried to explain that he had not been involved in the hanging, that he was simply following orders. "Following orders," Elijah repeated. "That's what Crawford said. That's what everyone says. It doesn't matter. You came hunting us. No one who comes hunting us will ever return." Harlan and his 6 men vanished as completely as Thornton's team had vanished. Their horses returned after 4 days, returned without riders, returned with evidence of violence that no one wanted to examine too closely. A marker was found where their trail had ended. For Ezekiel Russell, 1319 of many. The pattern had been established. The brothers had demonstrated that the mountains were their territory, that anyone who entered hunting them would become prey rather than hunter. The remaining marshals who entered, the 20th and 21st, who came in March of 1948, came with knowledge of what had happened to their predecessors, came with fear that their training could not entirely suppress, came anyway because duty or pride demanded that they try. They died the same way the others had died. The brothers had become artists of ambush, had learned the terrain so completely that they could appear and disappear at will, could strike from directions that seemed impossible and vanish before response could be organized. The final 2 marshals died in a hollow that would hold their bodies for 53 years, died without understanding how their positions had been compromised, died calling for backup that could not arrive. By the spring of 1948, 19 marshals had entered the mountains hunting the Russell brothers. None had returned. The area where they had vanished became known as the Dead Zone, a region that no lawman would enter voluntarily, that maps began to mark with warnings that official cartography had never before included. 2 more marshals entered the Dead Zone in March of 1948, entered against the advice of everyone who understood what the mountains held, entered because pride or duty or foolishness demanded that they try. Their horses returned after 2 days. Their bodies were never found. A marker documented their fate. For Ezekiel Russell, 2021 of many, all debts paid. 21 marshals killed over 5 months by 2 brothers who could not be found, who could not be tracked, who had become ghosts in mountains that protected them as completely as any fortress could have. The government eventually abandoned the search, classified the Russell brothers as fugitives who would likely die of natural causes in the wilderness, moved on to problems that could actually be solved. The Russell brothers did not die of natural causes. They lived, hidden in the deepest hollow in Letcher County, in terrain so remote that no trail approached it and no map documented it. Their grandfather had shown them the location when they were boys, had explained that the hollow was insurance against times when hiding might become necessary. That time had arrived, and the brothers had used what their grandfather had taught them. The hollow was approximately 3 miles long and a half-mile wide, surrounded by ridges so steep that approach was possible only through passages that appeared impassable to anyone who had not been shown their secrets. Springs provided water year-round. Game was plentiful because hunters never reached terrain so remote. The soil was fertile because generations of Russells had improved it against possibilities that had now become reality. They built a cabin together, constructed it from timber the hollow provided, created a structure that would serve them for the next 5 decades. The construction gave purpose to hands that grief might otherwise have made idle, gave direction to minds that completed vengeance might otherwise have left without aim. The cabin was larger than most survival shelters would have been, approximately 20 feet by 16 feet, because it needed to accommodate 2 men who would live together for the rest of their lives. They built it with care that exceeded what mere survival required, created a home rather than just a shelter, understood that this structure would be the only home they would ever know again. They divided the interior into spaces that served different purposes. A sleeping area held 2 beds positioned side by side, close enough that they could reach across the gap and touch hands if the night brought dreams that required comfort. A working area held tools for maintaining the equipment their lives required. A living area held chairs positioned before a fireplace where they could sit together in the evenings watching flames that reminded them of home. They had brought their father with them, not physically, but in the photograph they had saved, in the tools he had used, in the memories they maintained through conversations that structured their decades together. They built a shrine in their cabin, a corner where Ezekiel's photograph watched over their daily lives, where they could speak to him and feel that he heard. The photograph showed Ezekiel as he had been in his prime, showed a man whose strength and determination had been evident in every line of his face. They had taken the photograph from the cabin before the company could claim it, had carried it through their campaign of vengeance, had protected it through the decades that followed as carefully as they protected each other. They spoke to each other rarely. The communication they had developed through decades of brotherhood required few words. A glance could convey meaning that sentences would have diluted. A gesture could express understanding that explanation would have complicated. They had been together so long, had shared so much, that their thoughts often moved in parallel without any communication being necessary. But they spoke to their father constantly, maintained conversations with a man who existed now only in memory and in the justice his death had required. These conversations became rituals that structured their days, that gave meaning to hours that might otherwise have been formless. "Good morning, Pa," Elijah would say each day, addressing the photograph as morning light filled the cabin. "Isaiah and I thought we'd check the traps on the North Ridge today. The rabbits have been running good this season. You'd have liked seeing how many we've caught. Isaiah's getting even better at setting snares than he was during the war. You always said he had patient hands." "You were right." Isaiah would nod when Elijah spoke, would add his silent confirmation to his brother's words. Sometimes he would reach out and touch the photograph, would brush fingers across the glass that protected his father's image, would communicate through contact what his voice rarely expressed. "We got them all, Pa," Elijah told the photograph each anniversary of the hanging. "Every marshal who came hunting us, 21 of them over 5 months. They're buried in the hollow, Pa. They're part of the land now, the way you're part of the land. No one will ever find them. No one will ever find us. We kept our promise. We answered what they did to you." Isaiah would nod when Elijah spoke, would add his silent agreement to his brother's words. The brothers had always communicated this way, Elijah speaking for both, Isaiah confirming with presence and gesture. The decades did not change this pattern, they only refined it. They developed systems for survival that the years improved. They established gardens in clearings where sunlight penetrated the hollow's canopy, grew potatoes and beans and squash and corn that sustained them through seasons when hunting was difficult. They preserved vegetables through techniques their grandmother had taught them, accumulated stores that would carry them through winters when snow made the hollow nearly impassable. They hunted deer and turkey and smaller game that populated the hollow in abundance that their presence did not diminish. The wildlife had never been hunted before, the hollow was too remote for other hunters to reach, and the animals were unafraid in ways that made taking them almost too easy. The brothers developed ethics around their hunting, took only what they needed, ensured that populations remained healthy enough to sustain them indefinitely. They gathered plants whose properties their grandmother had taught them, created medicines that treated illness without requiring doctors who could not be reached. They learned the hollow's ecosystem completely, understood which plants could heal and which could harm, developed a pharmacy from the forest that kept them healthy through decades when professional medicine was not an option. The first years were consumed by vigilance that the killings had required. Every sound could be another marshal. Every movement in the forest could be another search party. The brothers maintained watches through those early years, took turns sleeping, kept weapons ready for threats that might come at any moment. They had established warning systems throughout the approaches to the hollow, had positioned triggers that would alert them to any approach, tripwires connected to bells, disturbed vegetation that would indicate passage, observation points where one brother could watch while the other rested. The systems were comprehensive, were designed by men whose marine training had taught them how to secure positions against enemies who wanted them dead. But the threats stopped coming. After the 21st Marshal had vanished, after the government had classified the brothers as fugitives unlikely to be found, the searches ended. The world moved on. The Russell brothers were forgotten by everyone, except the families of the men they had killed, and those families had been warned, by sources they never identified, that further attempts would produce further casualties. The warning systems remained in place for years after they were no longer needed, were maintained out of habit rather than necessity. Eventually, The brothers allowed them to fall into disrepair, allowed the hollow to return to the natural state that concealment no longer required. They had become ghosts, and ghosts do not need to fear the living. By the 1960s, the brothers had settled into routines that the decades would not disturb. They woke together, worked together, ate together, slept in the same cabin they had shared since childhood. They spoke little but understood much, communicated through a lifetime of shared experience that words could not have improved. They kept journals, documented their days and thoughts in notebooks they made from materials the wilderness provided. The journals revealed the depth of their bond, the completeness of their world, the sufficiency of a life that required only each other. "Isaiah found a new spring on the North Ridge today," Elijah wrote in an entry from 1975. "He didn't say anything about it, of course. He just led me to it, showed me the water coming up through the rocks, waited until I understood what he had found. That's how we've always been. He finds things, I name them, he shows me, I write it down. We're two halves of one person, Pa. We always have been." Isaiah's entries were rare but revealing. "Elijah sick today, Ka," he wrote in an entry from 1983. "I stayed with him. He got better. I would have stayed forever if he hadn't." This was the most Isaiah had written in a single entry in 36 years, and it said everything about what his brother meant to him. They grew old together in the hollow, watched each other's hair turn grey and then white, watched each other's bodies slow in ways that determination could delay, but not prevent. They adapted to aging with the same efficiency they had applied to everything else, developed techniques that allowed them to continue when strength alone would not have sufficed. By 2001, Elijah was 86 years old and Isaiah was 84. They had lived together in the wilderness for 54 years, had maintained the life they had built through half a century of seasons, had survived longer together than most brothers survive apart. The discovery came in September of 2001, came through a hiker who had wandered into terrain that maps showed as impassable. He found the cabin through luck that the brothers' skill had not anticipated, stumbled upon the structure and the men inside who had been legends for half a century. The brothers did not resist when authorities arrived. They had known for years that their time was ending, had known that the discovery they had avoided for 54 years would eventually occur. They simply waited, as they had waited for Marshals who had never returned, for the moment when their story would finally be told. "Our names are Elijah and Isaiah Russell," Elijah told the deputies who came to investigate. "In October of 1947, federal marshals hanged our father for crimes he didn't commit. He was murdered for land he wouldn't sell. We killed Marshal Crawford and 6 others who participated. Then we came up here. 21 more marshals came looking for us over the following months. We killed them all. We've been living up here ever since, waiting for our time to end." They were not prosecuted. The statute of limitations had expired decades before. All witnesses were dead except the brothers themselves, and the defendants were 86 and 84 years old, with health that half a century of isolation had compromised. The prosecutor who reviewed the case concluded that prosecution would serve no purpose except to separate 2 brothers who had never been separated in their entire lives. The confession produced headlines across the country. The story combined elements that fascinated the public: a father hanged unjustly, systematic vengeance, 21 marshals who had vanished without trace, 54 years of impossible survival, and 2 brothers who had lived together through everything the world had sent against them. Investigators who examined the hollow found the graves of the 21 marshals, found bodies that the cold ground had preserved well enough to confirm identification after more than half a century. Each had been killed efficiently, buried without ceremony, returned to earth that would hold them forever. The brothers had not tortured their victims, had not prolonged their deaths. They had simply eliminated threats with the efficiency that their marine training had provided. The brothers were permitted to remain together in a facility that provided the medical care their age required. They shared a room as they had shared a cabin, shared meals as they had shared food from gardens they had tended together, shared the final months of lives that had been intertwined since the day Isaiah was born. Isaiah died first on October 15, 2001, exactly 54 years after their father had been hanged. He died in his sleep, died with Elijah's hand holding his, died without speaking because he had never needed words to communicate with the brother who understood him completely. Elijah survived his brother by exactly 12 hours. He died on October 16, 2001. Died speaking words that only Isaiah could have understood. Died reaching towards something that witnesses could not see, but that his face suggested he recognized. "I'm coming, Isaiah," Elijah said in his final moments. "I'm coming. Pa's there too. I can see him. He's smiling. He says we did good, Isaiah. He says we did real good. Wait for me, brother. I'm coming home." The brothers were buried together in a single grave on the ridge overlooking the hollow where Russells had lived since 1802. Their father's remains were moved to rest beside them, the family reunited in death as they had been united in life and in vengeance. The inscription on the stone that marks all three graves reads, "Ezekiel Russell, 1884–1947, hanged for land he would not sell. Elijah Russell, 1915–2001. He answered his father's death. Isaiah Russell, 1917–2001. He stood beside his brother. 21 Marshals came looking. None returned. Together now. Together forever." The songs that emerged from the Russell brothers' story were among the most haunting in modern Appalachian tradition, their subject matter requiring melodies that captured both the horror of an unjust hanging and the devotion of brothers who never separated through 54 years of exile. The first verse described the family before the hanging, a father and two sons working land that their ancestors had claimed, a life that should have continued for generations. The melody was warm despite its subject, suggesting peace that should not have been disturbed. The second verse described the hanging itself, a father swinging for 10 minutes while his sons sat helpless in a cell, a death that planted seeds that would grow into 28 graves. The melody darkened, became something that suggested injustice crying out for answer. The third verse described the vengeance, 7 men hanging in the month after Ezekiel died, Crawford displayed in the same spot where he had watched an innocent man swing. The melody grew fierce, became the sound of sons answering what had been done to their father. The fourth verse described the Marshals, 21 men entering mountains that became their graves, horses returning without riders, markers documenting deaths that no one could prevent. The melody became something almost ghostly, became the sound of men vanishing into terrain that would never give them back. The fifth verse described the 54 years, 2 brothers living together in a hollow that the world forgot, speaking to a father who watched from a photograph, maintaining a bond that time could not weaken. The melody softened, became almost tender, suggested love between brothers that exceeded what words could capture. The final verse described the deaths and the burial, Isaiah going first and Elijah following 12 hours later, the brothers reunited with the father they had avenged, together at last in earth that would hold them forever. The melody resolved into something approaching peace, suggested that some bonds cannot be broken, not even by death. What about you, my friend? Would you make that journey to stand at the grave where Ezekiel and his sons rest together after 54 years of separation? Would you walk through the hollow where the brothers survived? Would you try to understand how love could sustain 2 men through half a century of exile? The journey is difficult. The brothers chose the location for remoteness that would prevent discovery, but some make the pilgrimage anyway. They come to see the cabin where Elijah and Isaiah lived, to understand what it means to love a father so completely that vengeance becomes purpose, to love a brother so completely that 54 years of isolation is merely the space between hanging and reunion. And that, my friend, is the true story of the Russell brothers who disappeared into Appalachia after the hanging, who killed 21 Marshals who came looking for them, who lived together for 54 years until death finally separated them for 12 hours before reuniting them forever. A story of love that injustice could not destroy, of devotion that decades could not diminish, of brothers who proved that some bonds are stronger than any force the world can send against them. The mountains remember, and through them, so do we all. So there you go, my friend. Now you know the rest of the story. The Russell brothers killed 28 men in answer to their father's unjust hanging, then disappeared into mountains that protected them for 54 years. 21 Marshals went looking, none returned. The brothers died within 12 hours of each other, were buried beside the father they had avenged. What about you? If Marshals hanged your father for crimes he didn't commit, Could you kill everyone who participated? Could you live with your brother for 54 years in a hollow that the world forgot? Could you love someone so completely that death separates you for only 12 hours before you follow them into whatever comes next? The mountains don't answer such questions. They simply endure, keeping their secrets and their dead. And some brothers love each other so completely that 54 years of exile is merely the space between hanging and forever. Thanks for listening to this story. And as always, remember that the hills have eyes and the hollows have memories. Be careful what you do in these mountains, because the mountains never forget, and neither do the brothers who call them home.